Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our launch of the Global Disinformation Index's report for Kenya for 2021. My name is Chris Roper. I'm the Deputy CEO for Code for Africa. We've partnered with the Global Disinformation Index since, I think, 2019 on the GDI for South Africa, and which has proven very useful over the last couple of years. And many of the newsrooms that have been surveyed for that report have reached out to us to ask for aid and tools to strengthen their resistance to disinformation vulnerability. The person who's going to guide you through today's panel is Rose Lukalo, who's an editor at PesaCheck. PesaCheck's our fact-checking organization. So Rose is particularly mired in the world of misinformation and disinformation. And those two things, of course, are existential threats for our media and therefore for our democracies. And this GDI, Global Disinformation Index, it's an important intervention, I think, in this battle for truth, especially in how it can be used to interrogate the business side of fake news and how advertising allows fake news to proliferate. So the GDI is not a rating system, as Clare from the GDI will probably be telling you very soon. It's really a tool to understand the vulnerabilities and the strengths of newsrooms. So, Rose, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. And I was hoping you'd give a little bit of background to how Code for Africa works, but I think we can ask. Do you want to do that, just in terms of the collaborative approach that has been used within the organization?
Well, I mean, I think I just want to be very brief because I want to leave the space for the experts to speak about the specifically Kenyan situation. But just to say that Code for Africa is a kind of a nose-to-tail organization when it comes to misinformation. So we have both the kind of hands-on whack-a-mole or whack-a-troll fact-checking part of what we do. And then we also have kind of deep investigations, kind of digital forensics side of what we do, which is really about going for looking what's behind the misinformation, who's profiting from it. So yeah, thanks, Rose.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let me just take the minute to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us. I think we consider this a really important point where we begin to open up the work that we've been doing. I think I don't really have to say that media is going through some really, really tough and crazy times. And what we've come to know over the years, everything that has been taught to us in school and from experience is being tested, questioned. We're almost having to recreate the space again. So we're not looking at the tools. We've looked at the tools that are shifting. We're looking at the standard ways of operating and disseminating. But I think what we want to zero in on today is really just to take a slice and look at standards, look at how we're being tested around the whole concept of truth and trust in the media. And I think we all know that that's a big part of what media sells or offers the public. It is the rigor and the standards that we maintain, the professionalism, but all that now we're having to create it again in this digital world. So basically what we want to do today is to present the work that's been done. It's been done within Code for Africa. Within Code for Africa, we have multiple units, so it has been a collaborative effect, but has been driven by one of our staff members from PesaCheck, which is where I am based, if you want to call it that. PesaCheck actually just looks at the whole misinformation sphere, and the other is from iLAB. We've invited panelists to join us today, industry specialists, academic specialists, really just to hear back from these two presenters and to share their thoughts with us on how we can further strengthen, improve, expand the work that's being done. I'm going to initially hand over to Clare Melford, who will tell us a little bit about the collaboration, a little bit more about the collaboration with GDI. What is GDI? How did it come about? And in the global context of the work that we've done, what is the methodology and goals that we're using and why? So Clare, can I hand it over to you?
Thank you very much, Rose, for the introduction, and good morning to everybody. I will attempt to share some slides, so give me a moment to pull those up. So as Rose said, my name is Clare Melford. I am the co-founder and the executive director of something called the Global Disinformation Index. And I'll start by giving a little bit of background on how GDI thinks about disinformation, how we go about assessing it, and then others more closely associated with the Kenya report will take you through some of the detailed findings from the report. So 3 years ago, when my co-founder and I started GDI, we did so because we could see that while there were many groups admiring the problem of online disinformation, there were very few groups that were actually offering practical solutions. And in fact, back then in 2018, nobody was following the money. No one was focusing on the financial incentive to create polarizing, toxic, divisive content. And it was this financial motive that we saw as having driven a large part in the explosive growth of the harmful online content we see today. Simply put, the internet is funded by advertising. It is advertisers that pay for the vast majority of the free services that we get on the internet today. It's the primary way for content creators and platforms to make money. And in a world of unlimited content, to get paid, you have to make your content get as many eyeballs as possible. And the more extreme you make that content, the more we human beings are likely to click on it. And hence, the more advertising dollars will be shown next to it while we are liking, sharing, commenting, or maybe even reading it. So this engagement-driven model, this attention-driven model, when given algorithmic amplification by social media platforms, has caused revenues at quality news outlets to slide the world over and caused this incentive to create low quality, toxic, polarizing, and divisive content. So GDI is a non-profit. We are dedicated to defunding disinformation. And we do it through assessing the risk of news sites carrying disinformation using a combination of artificial intelligence and also human review. And it's that human review part that we'll be talking about today. These assessments of news sites, we then provide to the online advertising community so that advertisers can decide whether or not they want their adverts to appear next to or on sites which have a high risk of disinforming. But first, let's define what we at GDI mean by disinformation. So disinformation for us is more than about truth or falsehood. We often use the term, we often avoid using the term fake news because many things that are true can still be deeply harmful. For example, if truth or lack of it was always the defining feature of disinformation, we'd be trying to remove all mentions of Father Christmas or Santa Claus from the internet, and clearly we're not. Sorry if I've offended any children listening in. But similarly, Breitbart, the notorious American news site, has a section called Immigrant Crime. These are all true stories about crimes committed by immigrants to the US. The problem with the content is not the falsehood. These are not untrue stories. It's the narrative, it's the framing, it's the cherry picking elements of the truth to perpetuate a false narrative that immigrants to the US commit crime at a higher rate than US born citizens. So fact checking is a hugely important part of the fight back against disinformation, but it cannot capture the full extent of the disinformation spectrum. So we think of disinformation through the lens of adversarial narrative. Adversarial narratives can be implicit or explicit. They are intentionally misleading, and they are adversarial against usually three different categories of content. So the content can be trying to set up an adversarial relationship between you, the reader of the content, and the subject of the content. And the subject could be an at-risk group, people's sexuality or gender or religion or race. Or it could be the subject of the content could be an institution. Think of content that is hostile to the media or the judiciary or the police or a democratically elected government. And then the third category of adversarial narrative is content that sets up an adversarial relationship against science itself. And here we see this a lot with the COVID pandemic, anti-vax content, 5G conspiracies, climate change denial. So all of this content may contain elements of the truth, but the harm comes from the fact that it's trying to set up a very adversarial relationship. And always, to be in GDI's definition of disinformation, really disinforming, there has to be this element of harm. All of these types of disinformation undermine trust in society and in democracies and in the institutions that support our lives. So this is a much broader definition of disinformation, but it allows us to create a more helpful definitional landscape when talking to advertisers. We don't have to say something is or is not disinformation. We can say this content is about someone's race. This content is about someone's gender. This content is about vaccines and is hostile to those subject matters. That allows advertisers more granularity and clarity about the sorts of content they want their ads to appear next to. So how do we do it in practice? It's important to note that GDI looks only at one piece of the disinformation puzzle. We look at open web content. We're not looking at video content or audio content podcasts. We're not looking at the social media platforms, or indeed what comes out of the mouths of elected officials, which is where a lot of disinformation comes from. We focus on written word news or news-like sites, and we attempt to assess their risk of carrying these adversarial narratives, and then give that data on risk assessment to the advertising community. So for a small number of high-profile sites, we use human reviews, and the people that we work with, like Code for Africa in Kenya, assess the sites using a methodology that's based on something called the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is the only ISO standard, for the International Standards Organization standard, for news media that's been designed by journalists. It's the partners that we work with in a country, in this case Code for Africa, who select the media sites and who carry out the assessments using GDI's methodology. And it's this that we're going to go through today. I'll just say a word about the rest of GDI's approach. For the long tail of sites on the internet, the vast majority of sites that tend to get a much smaller share of the traffic on the internet, we use machine learning, we use artificial intelligence classifiers to assess their risk of carrying these adversarial narratives, these anti-vax stories, these voter fraud stories. But it's the human review part that we're going to focus on today. So far around the world, GDI has performed with our partners these assessments in 18 countries. And Kenya is the latest example of these. And just before I hand over to the experts to share with you the results of the Kenya study, I'll just talk a little bit about how these ratings actually help disrupt the funding and the business model of disinformation. So every year, the Edelman Trust Barometer is released in January, and this report measures a range of sentiments about companies. And in 2021, the barometer measured for the first time the percentage of respondents in 28 countries surveyed who thought that advertisers should stop advertising on any media that did not prevent the spread of what they used the term fake news. We wouldn't, but they used that term. Across the globe, 72% of respondents said advertisers should take action and not place their ads, not support sites that were carrying disinformation. And Kenya was actually slightly higher than that. You can see it highlighted in red there. It was 77%. So the general public sees a role for advertisers in cutting the funding to news sites that traffic in this very harmful content that is dividing and polarizing our societies. And we at GDI hope that our assessments of news sites can help them do just that. And with that, I'll hand back to Rose. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. I think it's very important to the way you've laid the groundwork for what work is about to be presented here today. The important distinction of how you define disinformation and its evolving role in informing advertising. I think many media are not quite aware of this. They haven't quite made that shift. So I think it's really critical. As you say, there are experts who have actually handled the drafting of this report. The industry experts will come after that, will follow them, but let me just introduce the authors of the report. We have Naomi Wanjiku, who is my colleague at PesaCheck. She's a fact checker and a trainer with PesaCheck, which is a unit within Code for Africa, and she's based here with us in Nairobi. She's been fighting misinformation and disinformation at PesaCheck for several months with us, and she calls it a very fulfilling and learning experience. She has a background in journalism, as most people at PesaCheck do, and she has also 4 years of experience working in various newsrooms and publications locally. She's a graduate of Daystar University in Nairobi, Kenya. Our second researcher and co-author of the report is Robert Kiplangat, also based here in Kenya. Robin, where Robert came from, I don't know. Robin Kiplangat. Robin is CFA's data technologist and researcher at iLAB, which is another unit within Code for Africa. His engagement entails tracking disinformation and coordinated inauthentic behavior online. He focuses on finding creative ways to use technology in media, government, and civil society organizations, and works on the development of journalistic tools and software, which PesaCheck then uses, which help local newsrooms to produce innovative storytelling and to increase engagement with their audiences. Having said that, I'm not sure who's going first, but let me just welcome both Naomi and Robin to take over and tell us about the report itself.
Thank you, Rose. I'll be going fast, but I'm a bit worried that the session says it ends in 1 minute. I don't know if I should be worried or I should just proceed. I think I feel like it might cut me off when I'm speaking. Yeah, maybe someone can confirm if, indeed we are still in the agreed time.
Great. I think we're back. As we say, technology is constantly evolving for the news space, and I think that is just the timing mechanism. So, Naomi, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rose, for that good introduction. Yes, just as Rose has said, my name is Naomi Wanjiku, and I am a fact checker at PesaCheck. And I conducted the research together with my colleague Robin Kiplangat. And yes, I'll be sharing my screen so that I can brief you on what we were looking at while doing the research and our findings and what we recommend for the Kenyan media space. Yes, so let me just share my screen. Give me a moment. Yes, so just as Claire and Rose have said, we were looking at the disinformation risk assessment in the online news market in Kenya. And yeah, the main reason we did this study was to assess how vulnerable the Kenyan news media is to the spread of disinformation to their online audiences. And as we were doing this study, we focused on two pillars, that is the content pillar and the operations pillar. And the content pillar involves assessing how reliable the content of a news site is, while the operations pillar assesses the operational and editorial integrity of a news site. So we did a study of 29 news sites. Those were the ones that we selected, and we performed the risk assessment, and we found out that majority of the news websites we assessed fell under the medium risk. Most did not. Most of the news sites we assessed did not have a very high risk of spreading disinformation, and so the highest number was 13, which fell under the medium risk. Then it was followed by the low risk, which had 18 domains, and then minimum risk had 4 domains. So in total, the sites that fell between medium to minimum risk, there were about 25 sites. So only 4 domains scored high to maximum risk of spreading disinformation, and these are mainly the sites that are very likely to spread false information or disinformation in this case. And there were only 4. And as you can see on the table there, most of the news sites we assessed, they performed very well in the content pillar, but very poorly on the operations pillar. And so that means that the articles that were published in all these sites we assessed, they were very well done. So they did not have sensationalism and things like those. And but they lacked in the operational policies, which include editorial and operational policies. They did not include that on their sites, and they were not very transparent when it came to that. So the findings, and just as you saw on the previous chart, we had the highest. We had the lowest number of sites falling under the high to maximum risk rating, which are only 4. And in this, among these 4, what they had in common is that they published sensational and biased articles, which mainly targeted groups and individuals. So they also failed to meet universal standards for editorial and operational policies. So, and then the highest number of domains, which were 13, fell under medium risk rating. And what we discovered with these news sites is that they lacked key operational policies, and that includes, they did not include information about their sources of funding, and most of these sites, there's a very high potential of them moving to, the low risk spreading disinformation, because they only need to improve with providing details about their site's operation and their editorial policies. Yeah, so they observed most of the key things that we were looking for. And then there were the ones that fell between low to minimum risk rating. These were also a good number because there were 12, and they did very well in all content indicators. And they have many of the key operational policies in place, and they also performed well in the content indicators. But what they lacked mostly was operational transparency and editorial safety. So this means that they did not, they were not very transparent when it comes to how the organization is run, who sits in the executive editorial team, and who are the board of directors, and they also did not provide an editorial guideline on their website. So this is just a summary of our findings, and you can see all the sites that we assessed did very well in the content pillar, because the average score was 86% out of 100. And then they did very poorly in operations pillar, which was an average of 30. Then the overall score was 58. And of course, it became that low because of the operations pillar. So domains can improve their overall score by adopting the recommended operational checks. Yes, so that is it for my part. I will invite my colleague Robin Kiplangat to continue with what we would recommend for the Kenyan media space. So welcome, Robin.
Thank you, Naomi. So some of the notable risk factors that we can check, especially from the previous chart that we saw, was that the operation pillar was the one that performed quite poorly, and some of the notable key risk factors for the high scores for the content pillar was the aspect about failing to cover news events that had taken roughly give or take 30 days. And on the operations pillar, one of the key factors that contributed to the high scores was the lack of transparency in attribution, the presence of comment policies, and more so to do with declaring their source of funding and ownership. We also noted that a good number of domains do not openly display their editorial guidelines or policies, which they use to ensure that the content is accurate in that sense. So some of the actions that we think we recommend that these sites can adopt to address these shortcomings would be like adopting journalistic and operational standards, like those mentioned about the Journalism Trust Initiative. Why we insist on this is that this makes transparent information about overall policies on the site. The other recommendation that we've added is on publishing and availing statements on editorial independence, guidelines on ensuring accuracy and attribution in reporting, and also the policies for user-generated comments on the sites. We also recommend clearly publishing sources of funding as well as ownership information, as this information helps build trust in the site and also dispel doubts about site funding or any conflict of interest that may exist. We also recommend the sites to ensure that bylines are published, as publishing the identity of authors or such policies as to why this information is held would be an easy way to ensure transparency and accountability is withheld. The other thing that we recommend is about refraining from publishing news articles that are not verifiable, or if they have to also ensure that relevant primary sources are quoted when doing so. So these are some of the recommendations that we shared, and that would sum what we had as part of the report. So thank you, Amanda, and back to you, Rose.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi and Robin. If there's any very pressing clarification that anybody would want, from the two presenters of the report. Perhaps we can take that here, because they've moved quite fast. But otherwise, we're going to go on to our panelists. I don't see a hand. Mark, do you see any?
No, I think we can go ahead with the panel.
Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, even as editor of the report, I found it extremely interesting. I think it begins to concretize how much we need to be aware of as media, how much is changing, how much expectation from audiences, expectation from advertisers is changing. We're being required to tell and show more and more. Posting editorial policies, I don't think is something that media houses think about, but people want to know, how are you making your decisions? How are you arriving at what you do and don't cover? They want to know who owns it. They want to know how you're funded. They want to know all these conflicts of interests. So we have a very, very high-powered, eminent panel drawn both from industry and from academia. And I want to start by inviting Dr. Njoki Chege, who is the director of the Innovation Center at Aga Khan University, just to give us a little bit of feedback. What are you thinking, and what is your gut response to what you've heard and seen in the report? Njoki, welcome.
Thank you very much, Rose. It's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations on the report. This is a very timely report, particularly in the field that I play in and the field that I operate in, and that is media innovation. We work with a lot of journalism startups. And what we have been seeing is the need for very clear editorial guidelines, because in as much as there's the so-called mainstream media, there's also this other universe of content creators and content producers that are attracting a lot of audiences, particularly the under 35s, the younger audiences. And what we've been seeing is a very clear outline with regards to the editorial guidelines. You talked about funding, which is actually very important. A lot of startups that we work with mainly rely on donor funding. A lot of them are not yet sustainable. They're not yet making money from advertising or other forms of revenue. So a lot of the stories that they're doing right now are donor funded, and the issue of ethics, who exactly paid for this story, becomes very critical. So I think what I see as a possible way forward with regards to this report is a very deliberate and intentional effort to build capacity of journalistic startups in East Africa. A lot of them are, former journalists who used to work in newsrooms, and now they're going out on their own. So a lot of them will need training with regards to issues of fake news and disinformation, editorial policies within those startups. What is it that they stand for? We've seen a lot of international startups in the US and in the UK being very clear about their editorial policies, but only a few in the local scene in East Africa in particular. So what I see as a way forward, like I said earlier on, is very deliberate capacity building, training of these journalistic startups, training the founders, the journalists on best practices, on ensuring that they're not playing to the disinformation universe. Then, of course, from a scholarship perspective, I think we still need to do a lot more research to not only inform the decisions that we are making, but also to understand how we stand and where where we stand with regards to disinformation. A lot of this research has been done by international organizations, which is okay, but I think there's some nuance that comes out and floats to the top when such kind of research is done, particularly by local scholars, to see how this plays within the international scene. So, Rose, I'm going to leave it at that and possibly circle back when the rest of the panelists have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you, Njoki. I think it's the concerns that you raise are very interesting, and I think sometimes that's another shift that perhaps we're not seeing. It may not always be visible that journalists are doing other things in that space and trying to recreate what has been lost. So also, it's very important that you raise that there's this kind of regrouping, if you would, of journalists that need support, because very often we target the traditional mainstream, the visible, rather than this unseen kind of group. I want to move then to, we were to have Mr. Omoyo, the Chief Executive of the Media Council of Kenya, the regulator. I can see Leo. Are you here in his stead? Because I don't see Omoyo on the call.
Yeah, I'm not Omoyo, but I'm sitting in for him. This is Leo.
Okay, Leo, would you have some thoughts? Would you like to respond to the report?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity. I was called urgently to sit in for Moyo, who was there to take a flight to Mombasa for the PRSK event, where he's also making a speech. So I think, I work at the Media Council of Kenya, which sets media standards and enforces those standards, talking about media ethics, media law, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we do in the department where I work, research and strategy, planning and strategy, is fact checking. And we are very much involved in that every single day, every single minute, hour. We are online and we are trying to look at what is happening in mainstream media. We're trying to look at what is happening in news websites and generally social media and other sources of news. And what happens is that we have monitors, media analysts who are on top of things, and they are able to debunk immediately when an issue arises, and that involves also debunking mainstream media. And most of the articles, most of the issues are published in the Media Observer, a newsletter published by the Media Council on weekly basis. So, and I think we have seen a lot of issues that are coming up, and that speak to what is being what the report is talking about here. And one, of course, I need to laud this effort. It is. I mean, according to Sustainable Development Goals, one of the objectives of Sustainable Development Goals is to localize international efforts so that they speak to local nuances in a way that we can be able to appreciate them. And I think this is one way of doing that, indexing disinformation at the local level, which is Kenya. And therefore, as Media Council, we really truly appreciate this effort and would be happy to be involved in future related efforts as such. So we'll agree that that there is. I've seen one of the recommendations being that there is need to adopt journalism as one of the key approaches, to the news media, the news media platforms, especially when it comes to the websites, the Tuko, the Nairobi Leo, and Daily Post, and the rest. And I think this is a conversation that has been ongoing for some time. And I remember in 2019, the bloggers, the influencers, and the guys who do the the websites approached Media Council to come up with to help them come up with a mechanism of what we call self-regulation. Self-regulation, basically focusing on a way that speaks to certain standards that are accepted by these actors. And one area of contention that we saw was when you talk about disclosure on sources of funding, disclosure on sources of who is, for example, funding a tweet, who is funding, who is funding a news item on Daily Post, who is funding a news item on tuko.co.ke. And most of the argument was that the bloggers do not really agree that they should disclose the person funding, and especially that they don't want to have a tweet indicated against a sponsor because it's going to affect their rating in the area. So when the recommendations comes that we need to adopt the way journalism operates, then I agree with that, and Media Council agrees with that, and we are having this conversation to the extent that there is probably the need to define who a journalist is, so that then we don't talk about a journalist as traditional, that a journalist is somebody who is qualified in A, B, and C, but a journalist is somebody who is involved in the manufacturing of news. So that then, if you're involved in the business of manufacturing and disseminating news, developing, picking information out there and disseminating it to the public, then that person should be bound by certain standards, and those standards are what I think we are calling media ethics. The other issue I think that is coming out, and that we agree with, the issue of publishing editorial guidelines and having them visible for everyone to see. Of course, the challenge is, do we really expect the startups that Dr. is talking about to do that? We have Nairobi Leo, which is individually owned, and of course we know that it uses mainstream journalists to collect its data, but it's a process, because, for example, they just started the other day. Do we really do we want to make it a must that before these news websites start operating, that they must come up with editorial guidelines and start publishing them from onset? And what is going to be the impact of that, in the market and the creative industry, for that matter? So that for me would be, a question that I would throw back to the researchers in this meeting. And there is the issue which is coming out of just for us as Media Council. Let me just say that mainstream media, I think if you look at the Radio Africa Group and you Google their editorial guidelines, those are available online, and anybody who wants to hold them to account on certain issues, they can always do that. Of course, we have the Code of Conduct for the Practice of Journalism that has been used to localize, and for media houses that have picked this code and localized it and owned it as their own. So that when you go to Nation Media Group, for example, you find their editorial guidelines are online, and you can be able to use that to gauge their content and whether they are living up to those standards. So there's that differentiation between what we call mainstream media and the new media, and how the new media is approaching the whole idea of journalism, the whole idea of manufacturing and disseminating content as media content or as news. And I mean, it's still, for us, it's still a very convoluted sector in terms of at the legal level, at the policy making level, and also at the practice implementation level. So I mean, those are the points that I'll make for now. Thank you so much, Rose.
Thank you, Leo, and thank Omoyo for at least sending in somebody to stand in his stead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think the questions are also mounting, but I will hold them for the moment and speak to the president of the Kenya Editors Guild. We always say that with a little emphasis. We were not allowed to call anybody president for the longest time. So when we say president now, it's with a little bit of force. So let me welcome Churchill Otieno, who until very recently was also involved in digital. He was the head of the digital section at one of the largest media organizations in Eastern Central Africa, which was the Nation Media Group. Welcome, Mr. President. Okay, I think, Churchill, you may have to join us again. You may have to leave and join us again because we can't hear your audio. So, if that's okay. Perhaps we can invite Professor George Nyabuga. Professor Nyabuga is Associate Professor at what we used to call the School of Journalism. He tells me it's now a department within the Faculty of Arts at the University of Nairobi. Written a lot on media performance in this part of the world. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Rose. I think it's, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, very good. Just want to say quickly that just a correction. It's Faculty of Social Sciences. I think we fall in there, although there's a bit of confusion. But thank you for inviting me to this platform. I think it's important to engage in such conversations as we seek to understand, of course, disinformation and what that means in a society that relies on information for various reasons, but particularly with regard to decision-making processes. As we know, and especially from the academic perspective or an academic perspective, evidence is always important. It's key to our understanding of what disinformation is and why, for example, people privilege disinformation and not sometimes truthful information. But as Clare made it very clear, sometimes disinformation could actually be maybe truthful information. And that's why the focus on disinformation, which is deliberately offered to maybe mislead the public. And I think we've seen a lot of that during the COVID era. And I think it's important for us to understand what disinformation is, particularly at the moment when we're preparing for the 2022 elections. And if you see a lot of what is shared on WhatsApp platforms and various social media platforms, you see what role disinformation will play in decision-making processes. And we as academics and perhaps professional media people, we should be concerned about the levels of disinformation at the moment. For example, the effects it has had on professional journalism and established media platforms that are, of course, keen on offering truthful, objective, impartial information that people can rely on. So reliable, credible, and truthful information is important at the moment. And those always, of course, been important in the context of media. And I especially like the idea that, what we are seeing right now is attention-driven business models. And I say this because, we've had conversations, various conversations, a lot of conversations on media sustainability and viability. At the time when COVID is threatening media survival, media sustainability and viability at the end of the day. And consequently, what we seem to see, as Clare pointed out, is that disinformation seems to obviously travel faster, further, and deeper than truthful information, which is a serious thing, considering the fact that there is increasing use, particularly among the young population that may not, for example, possess media and information literacy, and of course other people to determine what is truthful and whether some of these platforms present information that can be relied upon. And what we see is, of course, that at the end of the day, if we rely a lot on disinformation, that would affect the quality of the discourses that we have on various issues, including the important democratic exercise, which is maybe political behavior in one or the other, and what then that means in the context of decision making and democracy. And of course, participation, especially political participation. And I think that is something that we should be worried about. The other thing is, of course, as truth becomes a victim of disinformation, we also see that affects the media, and consequently the media itself, in general. When I talk about the media, I'm talking about the media in general, and especially the more professional, established media, becoming a victim of disinformation and some of these technologies. We should, of course, acknowledge that technological disruptions, and sometimes we consider technological disruptions being positive. For a long time, we consider that being negative. But as we always say, sometimes problems cause innovations, or those threats contribute to innovation. So sometimes the threats posed by disinformation may make people to be more innovative, and consequently maybe seek other platforms through which they can engage with other perhaps audiences or other people, as a way of determining what at the end of the day is credible for consumption and use. Of course, the issue that I think the two presenters, Naomi and Kiplangat, one of the issues that they pointed out was sensationalism and bias. And sometimes maybe I don't see, but this may be controversial, any problem with sensationalism. And I think we've seen a lot of media, established media, engaging in some sort of sensationalism. Sometimes this draws attention, of course, to issues that are of great public interest. But as I said, sensationalism sometimes is a choice of words and the framing of issues. But as long as sometimes the content supports maybe headlines, then I personally do not see a problem with such issues. But as I said, maybe headlines must be supported by content. The other thing is, of course, that a biased media is, of course, seen as being problematic from a professional perspective. And consequently, we say that the media ought to be objective. But I think in the recent past, we've started to see people pushing for media to declare their stand on various issues. And sometimes that is what we need. It has sometimes been argued that an objective media is a bystander media because they don't want to take positions on various things. And consequently, when we talk about objectivity, sometimes we demand that the media offers different perspectives to different issues. But in the context of disinformation, in the context of perhaps an adversarial maybe a situation that we find ourselves in, and that's something that also Clare talked about, disinformation, adversarial media and adversarial narratives sometimes create tensions and polarizes society. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point out that, if a credible media, states very clearly that it supports a particular position, it supports, for example, the protection of the environment, takes a position against corruption. Sometimes that is what we need, because media people or journalists and, media executives are part of a society, and the media ought to be part of, the kind of solutions that we're seeking for the various problems that we have in society. One of the recommendations that I would have wanted to see in the report is a serious investment in media and information literacy, given the fact that sometimes people do not understand what informs media practices and what informs the choice of issues to cover, or the way the same issues are framed. So maybe that is something that ought to be included in the report to ensure that people at the end of the day understand what disinformation is, as opposed to, say, the common terminology that is often used, which is fake news. And I think that was discussed earlier. And let me leave it there, and I think we can engage further in these conversations. Thank you, Rose.
Thank you, George. I'm not sure that Churchill was able to rejoin us. Are you there, Churchill?
No, Churchill hasn't been able to rejoin, unfortunately.
And Rosemary said she might be late. Is she there?
I don't believe so, but I'll keep.
Okay. Yeah, I think those were the two we were expecting. Rosemary had sent a message that she would join us later, and she still may. I think we have managed to cover quite a bit of ground, and there's space now for some conversation, so we can open up the space to questions. And as they come in, let me kick it off, since I have the space at the moment. Claire, perhaps you could shed a little bit of light. Oh, there's a question there. Okay, for the panel, is there enough work being done to understand mis- and disinformation in the Kenyan context? That is from Chris. I wanted to ask my own, which is, how did GDI settle on the two pillars that it has selected for the methodology? And the second question is, both to Clare and to the researchers, the authors of this report, what has been the reception of this report by media in Kenya and in other markets as well?
Panel. So I think you asked a question about how we alighted on the two pillars of content and operations. Was that your first question?
Yes, it was.
That was. Okay, great. So the methodology that GDI developed was, as I mentioned in the introduction, based on the Journalism Trust Initiative. And the Journalism Trust Initiative is an initiative run from Reporters Without Borders. And it focuses largely on a series of checks and balances that media outlets can put in place, things like the policies and procedures that we talked about in the research results. And because that is a standard for journalism created by journalists for journalists, it felt like a really important part to include in our operations pillar. We've taken it a little bit further in that while the Journalism Trust Initiative will just ask an organization, a news organization, to self-report, do you have a policy of editorial independence, for example? What our researchers will do, as they will explain, is they don't just look on the website and see if that policy is published, but they'll actually try and request it from the organization to see if it does exist, because publishing it is one thing, but you can still have the policy and not publish it. So the operations pillar was felt to be very important because it builds off a standard created by journalists of what they think are important checks and balances to help maintain quality of news. On the content side, obviously, what's written on the page is critical as well, and therefore we needed to have some method of assessing the content. But when you're doing an assessment like that, it's very easy to introduce your own biases. So we've taken great steps to try to minimize the amount of bias that the researchers bring in. So what they actually assess is completely stripped, anonymized content. It doesn't. They get the text of an article, but without the masthead or any of the images or fonts that might give them an indication of what paper or outlet the content is coming from. so that the assessments that they give are as independent of any biases that they might have as possible. So we've taken quite a few steps to try and minimize the introduction of our own biases. But those two legs, those two pillars of the floor, if you like, of what are the policies under which content is created, and then the content itself, seem to us to be the two most important ways you can judge the risk of an outlet being at risk of carrying disinformation.
Thank you. We have another 4 minutes from our clock. I think that marks the end of the session, but I think we will need to keep an eye on that. To the rest of the panel, Naomi, Robin, 3 questions on the, there's a question there, and the other one is, what has been the response to the media, from the media? Naomi? Robin?
Hi, Ross. I'm trying to look at the questions. Which one in particular?
Okay, the one on the screen. Is there enough work being done to understand misinformation, disinformation specifically in Kenya? Is the first. The second one is one that I just put to you was, I believe you shared this document, this report with media houses, and what was their response to it?
I think we may not respond on their response, because I think the report was launched today, so that's something probably we could watch and share later. So that may not necessarily something we can address for today. But I thought probably part of the thing, since we didn't get any details about any work being done around misinformation or fighting disinformation, because within the Kenyan context, what we've seen is, I think the Minister of Interior a few months back had put out a statement saying there's a tribunal that will be formed that will be fighting or monitoring online conversations, more so to do with hate speech. And beyond that, I don't think there's been any conclusive details about proper measures that have been put in place towards that. So that, and addressing some of the cyber laws that probably may need to look at, could be some of the things that I may hint towards looking through and seeing if there's anything that has been captured by it.
Rose, just to add to what Robin has said, I think there are some efforts in fighting mis and disinformation in Kenya, but there's definitely more that needs to be done. So far, Code for Africa has been doing some trainings. We've been training newsrooms on how to identify misinformation and disinformation. So there's definitely some efforts, and we have seen various media houses in Kenya establishing a fact-checking desk, and they have started flagging false information online, and therefore that's an effort.
Okay, so Naomi, we lost you briefly after you said opening up the fellowships for training.
Yes. Yeah, sorry about that. So there are some efforts that have been put in place in Kenya, such as the initiative by Code for Africa to train journalists on how to fact check, and it's just by the beginning. So we are expecting that going forward, more and more people will become literate on how to identify this disinformation, and they'll be able to fight it. And we can do this alone. So the more media personalities and the more the media knows about it, and also the public knows about what disinformation entails, the more we'll be able to fight this war faster. Yeah, so that would be my response.
Great. Do we have any other questions, Mark? There we go. Dr. Njoki, to what extent do universities research the problem of disinformation in Kenya, and do you have any examples? Njoki, are you still with us? Okay. I think we can throw
Yes,
that.
Yes, I can hear you
joining
now.
the stage in a moment. 1 minute.
Okay. All right. George can also throw in something after her.
To what extent do universities research the problem of disinformation in Kenya? Any examples? Thank you very much, Chris Rapper, for that question. So I think the research output with regards to local universities still needs a lot of support, particularly with regards to funding. There's not a lot of funding around a lot of research, let alone research on disinformation, particularly in the country. So other than what individual scholars, professors do at an individual level, I don't think there's a lot, there are big studies like you would compare maybe to other countries in the West. So the issue here is about funding, and that's why I said at the beginning of my remarks that there needs to be some funding that spills into academia, into Kenyan universities, possibly collaborative research projects that can speak to issues of disinformation. The closest we have come to any kind of research, I think, is what we are currently doing at the Aga Khan University. We are conducting a research on media viability in East Africa, and that is a donor-funded research project. We're also doing something else on youth consumption habits, which will also speak to issues of disinformation. We have a research question or two regarding disinformation. But what I'm saying is that there's not much that has been done at a large scale level. And I think this needs us to think critically about how we can support research efforts at the university. Thank you. Maybe Professor George can chime in.
Yes, thanks, Njoki. I think for me, I've seen a bit of research, and especially at the master's and perhaps PhD levels. Not many, as Njoki pointed out, and there could be various reasons for that. One of them is funding. Another one is perhaps lack of interest in this area. Although I know that students are always coming up with various research projects and topics, and this is one of those that are interesting, and especially because disinformation particularly affects decision making. So many of them might be specifically looking at a particular issue, and not the very broad issue of just disinformation by itself. It is tied to a particular issue, and as I said, I think I've seen a few studies on disinformation and perhaps its effects on issues like democracy or political participation or political behavior. So yes, there might be a few, not as many as we may have wanted, but nonetheless, I think it's a good start.
Thank you, George. And I think a critical question as we go to elections, and with the understanding of what has happened in previous years, I think we're still recovering from Cambridge Analytica and other examples. And iLAB has has documented quite a few cases of deliberate political misinformation. So a critical question actually for Kenya at this particular moment. And the timing of Rosemary is very, very perfect. As we discuss examples of what universities are doing around the issue of disinformation. I want to invite Rosemary Okello-Olale, who's the director of the Africa Media Hub at Strathmore University. Unfortunately, she was not able to join us earlier, and we are actually running out of time, so I'm going to be very, very strict with you, Rosemary. Just 2 or 3 minutes, if you can chime in and tell us a bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Actually, I got in when George and Njoki was talking about the role of university in actually enhancing research on disinformation. And it's really a critical moment. I'll just give quickly an example how research actually can help in disinformation and especially the media in actually highlighting it. In 1997, within the Editors Guild, we did just a small, what we call a research on the impact of the media in escalating ethnic violence within the Rift Valley, and found out actually the language the media used then was one of the ways in which was used. So since then at Strathmore, actually here, we've been actually involved in research with Professor Nick. We're looking at taking your research to policymakers, civil society, on how misinformation can be able to actually be looked into from academic point of view. And we are looking at how to design and disseminate disinformation, especially during the upcoming election, in partnership with the University of London, as well as also Durban University. And just to highlight why the research, we took it as a career, as a critical point within the Strathmore, is in that it's not misinformation, it's amplified propaganda, especially with the social media that is taking place. And with this, we found out that unless we have certain framework and a way in which the media can be able to see how this using social media has become a propaganda platform, it's going to escalate, especially in upcoming election. So just to highlight some of the key things we are looking into how actually Twitter is being used as a propaganda tool, social media such as WhatsApp, how it's being used. So we are having certain ways in which we are looking throughout the country, and even Facebook. But more importantly, it's how actually we are able to, we don't just use more than just 2 hashtags, how hashtag can be marked as spam. And that hashtag, that spam, can actually be used as a propaganda in a way that can create a reality. And some of the case studies that were being used when we were being training trainers here was work that was done by Code for Africa, using actually a case study of Standard Media Group, how their kind of some of the narrative they used were actually turned into propaganda as a spam. And many people believed it until they were able to go behind the story and say, actually, this was false. So unless we have what we call a portal that is going to look at day to day, and this release of this research is very, very timely, how as media organization we can have a portal on how to analyze stories that the consumer are actually engaging in, how the story is impacting their life. Are they truthful? How are they being positioned? How are they being used? We are still a long way in addressing disinformation when it comes to the use of media. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary, and sorry to put you under such pressure. We have 4 minutes until the session ends, and this technology is quite brutal. Let me ask, there was a question put up. Mark, can you read it again? It was, yes. I'm going to ask Nyabuga. Churchill has sent his apologies. He's got very bad network where he is. George, very briefly, do you have any policy level examples of standards?
Yes. Let me say very quickly that we have been in conversations with various organizations and actors in Kenya within the ambit of the Kenya Media Sector Working Group on trying to, for example, develop standards that would enhance credible journalism. And I say this because seen, obviously, in the recent past, unethical practices within the media industry. Sometimes it's problematic when we're dealing with online platforms that may not be as professional as, say, established media houses. And consequently, I think to rein in some of the journalists that operate these online platforms has become increasingly difficult because they may be based everywhere and nowhere, and may not be under any jurisdiction really. They may be obviously based in certain places, but it becomes difficult for organizations like the Media Council of Kenya, which regulates media, regulates journalism, to deal with them. And of course, they may also not be captured by what CA does, the CA in one word. So yes, they have been this, but I think it is difficult sometimes to really maybe let me say admonish them or sanction them for whatever it is that they're doing, especially this.
Okay. Thank you, George. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But like we said in the beginning, this is like an opening to the conversation. It's not the end. I think we will be taking up many opportunities just to share this study and to disseminate it as widely as possible and encourage conversation around these issues. These are issues that we deal with, we work on every day. When you talk about disinformation and the coordinated campaigns, we often think that we're just reporting misinformation, and then after a while you start to see. So really, I think we're at the infancy of this study and this standardization of the work that we're confronted. Let me just thank you all. Sorry, there was an echo. I want to say a quick thank you to all our panelists, a quick thank you to CEO Chris Roper. I saw Justin Arenstein. Thank you very much, Clare, Melford, and very big thanks and congratulations to Naomi and Robin for the study that they've done. I hope that we're going to have very many more conversations around this. It's critical for us in Africa at this time. So with that, thank you.